And as the fallout from the recent budget continues, 6 News spoke to Steve Baty from the Australian Democrats.
The biggest thing that we saw on Tuesday night was the first surplus in a budget since the global financial crisis. We haven't seen one since 2008. I think the last one was where we had this sort of massive global impact in the economy. The Labor government at the time had to spend money to inject that stimulus into the budget, and we've not seen a surplus since. So I think the biggest thing for everyone was to look at that budget on Tuesday night and see a relatively modest surplus at $4.2 billion, but a surplus nonetheless. And after 9 years of the coalition government promising that we were going to get there, and we had that whole back in black thing in 2019 that never actually eventuated, to actually have Labor deliver a surplus is a big thing. So that would be number one for me, is just the fact that they were able to deliver a surplus. Now, the way in which they did that is interesting. And they were also quite clear to point out that the surplus won't last. So we should have one this year. We aren't expected to have one next year or the year after or the year after that. But over those forward estimates, the position of the budget has improved by around $125 billion. And that's quite a substantial shift in that sort of underlying performance of the economy. And some of that is we've got very high employment at the moment, very low unemployment. That's more people working, more people being paid, and obviously more people paying tax. Those people are spending money, and we collect GST from it. We've got really good commodity prices, very high iron ore prices. I think iron ore price at the moment is double what the estimates were in October even, let alone last May. And also, obviously, we've got record high prices in things like coal and gas going on at the moment. So all of those things have contributed to this really strong position from a revenue point of view. The other thing, though, that wasn't talked about, and Jim Chalmers didn't mention it at all in his budget speech, were $74 billion in savings over the next 4 years through changes to the NDIS, so the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is overseen by Bill Shorten. They've introduced some changes to the eligibility criteria. They're looking at tightening some of those criteria, with the aim of reducing the growth rate of the NDIS. So the NDIS, I'm sure your listeners and your watchers will be familiar, is one of the highest growing items on the federal budget at 13.8% per year. The aim in this budget and the objective that's been given and the savings that they've identified come from reducing that growth rate to only 8% per year. So that delivers savings of about $59 billion over the forward estimates of these next 4 years, and then an additional $15 billion in savings from program efficiencies. So that was a big one in the scheme of things, and it really wasn't spoken about at all. And then, of course, as we touched on last week, the stage 3 tax cuts are a big item. They weren't discussed. They haven't changed. They're still in the budget, and they're still there in the forward estimates, contributing $69 billion in lost revenue that the government intends to give up when those tax cuts kick in next year. Jim Chalmers, in his interview on the ABC directly after the budget speech, when he was talking to David Spears, indicated that I think he used the phrase, we did as much as we could afford. And he used the excuse that, we might have a surplus this year, but next year we won't. It'll be sort of $13 to $15 billion deficit. And the year after that, it's more like 35. And the year after that, it's 35 again. So whilst this year looks good, we just can't afford to do everything. And yet, as we've just been talking about, there's $21 billion a year of that deficit is coming from these stage 3 tax cuts. So to put through those tax cuts, and as we've spoken about before, overwhelmingly those tax cuts go to the highest income earners in our society. Those earners are overwhelmingly male. So it's putting money into the pockets of the people who need it less and least in our society, and then using the excuse that, well, we don't have enough money to do more for the people who are really hurting hard. $2.85 a day is not very much. Let's be honest, it's really not very much. And even if you save it up and spend the $40 at the end of the fortnight, it's still not very much. The Economic Inclusion Advisory Commission, in their report, indicated that it should be closer to $264 a fortnight. We're nowhere near that. And that was a minimum kind of benchmark that they were putting forward as the need to increase the rate up to something that was deemed adequate from a support payment sort of point of view. So to turn around and go, well, we can't afford it, and the best we can do is $2.85 a day. If I were someone receiving JobSeeker or one of those other support payments, I feel they should rightly feel aggrieved by that decision from the Treasurer and the Labor Party. You know, back when Tony Abbott came to power in 2013, he did it on the back of those billboards and trucks that he drove around of Labor's debt and deficit, handle on the economy. It's been a label that they've worn since the Whitlam era, I should say. It's 50 years of Labor being held out as people who don't know how to manage the economy. The reality is that Labor governments have done a much better job of handling the economy every time they've been in power since the Whitlam years. We've only ever had two treasurers who've been rated #1 in the world by the OECD, and that's Keating and Wayne Swan.